Let me tell you about something that's unfolding right now in December 2025 that's about to create serious headaches for American car buyers and massive problems for U.S. automakers. Japan's manufacturing sector is experiencing a significant slowdown, and because of how deeply integrated Japanese suppliers are into American automotive production, we're about to see disruptions ripple through the U.S. auto industry in ways that will affect everything from vehicle availability to prices to employment. This isn't a sudden crisis. This is the result of multiple overlapping problems in Japan that have been building for months and are now reaching a critical point where the effects can no longer be absorbed or worked around. Start with what's happening in Japan. The country's Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index, a key indicator of factory activity, has been contracting for several consecutive months, sitting below 50, which indicates shrinking activity. Industrial production is down. Factory orders are declining. Export volumes are dropping. Several factors are driving this slowdown. First, China's economic problems are hitting Japan hard. China is Japan's largest trading partner, and when Chinese demand weakens, Japanese manufacturers feel it immediately. China's ongoing property sector crisis, high youth unemployment, and sluggish consumer spending mean Chinese buyers are purchasing fewer Japanese goods, from machinery to electronics to automotive components. Second, the yen has been volatile, creating uncertainty for exporters. After years of weakness that helped Japanese exporters by making their products cheaper in foreign markets, the yen has strengthened somewhat in late 2025, making Japanese exports more expensive. This hurts competitiveness and reduces orders. Third, energy costs remain elevated. Japan imports nearly all its energy, and while prices have come down from the extreme peaks of 2022, they remain significantly higher than pre-pandemic levels. This increases manufacturing costs and squeezes profit margins. Fourth, labor shortages are intensifying. Japan has the world's oldest population and a declining workforce. Manufacturing companies struggle to find workers, especially younger workers willing to do factory jobs. This limits production capacity even when demand exists. Fifth, there's increasing competition from South Korea and China in sectors where Japan has traditionally dominated: semiconductors, advanced electronics, precision machinery. Japanese companies are losing market share in key industries. The result is that Japanese factories are producing less, which means they're supplying less to their customers worldwide. And for the U.S. auto industry, this is a major problem because of how dependent American automakers are on Japanese suppliers. Let me explain the depth of this dependency. Japanese companies supply critical components to virtually every American automaker. We're not just talking about Japanese car companies like Toyota, Honda, and Nissan that have plants in the U.S. We're talking about General Motors, Ford, Stellantis. All of them rely heavily on Japanese suppliers for parts you don't see, but that are absolutely essential to building modern vehicles. Electronics and semiconductors are a major category. Renesas, a Japanese company, is one of the world's largest suppliers of automotive microcontrollers, the chips that control everything from engine management to safety systems to infotainment. Japanese companies supply sensors, control units, and electronic components that go into millions of American-built vehicles every year. Advanced materials are another critical area. Japanese companies produce specialized steel alloys, aluminum, high-strength composites, and advanced plastics that are used in vehicle structures. These aren't commodity materials you can easily source elsewhere. They're engineered to specific standards for safety, weight reduction, and performance. Precision components like bearings, gears, transmissions parts, and suspension components come from Japanese suppliers who have decades of expertise in manufacturing to extremely tight tolerances. Japanese quality standards in these areas are often considered the global benchmark. Batteries and hybrid systems are increasingly important. As automakers electrify their fleets, Japanese battery manufacturers and suppliers of hybrid powertrains play crucial roles. Panasonic supplies batteries for Tesla and other manufacturers. Japanese companies provide motors, inverters, and control systems for hybrid vehicles. The numbers illustrate the scale. Japan exports roughly $50 billion worth of auto parts annually to the United States. Japanese suppliers operate hundreds of facilities in the U.S., employing tens of thousands of workers producing components for American assembly plants. The automotive supply chain is so integrated that it's almost impossible to build a car in America without Japanese components somewhere in it. Now, with Japanese manufacturing slowing, deliveries of these components are being delayed. Lead times are extending. Some suppliers are cutting production forecasts, and American automakers are starting to feel the impact. The first visible effect is inventory tightening. U.S. automakers maintain just-in-time inventory systems designed to minimize the cost of storing parts. They receive components days or sometimes hours before they're installed in vehicles. This efficiency works beautifully when supply chains function smoothly, but when suppliers can't deliver on schedule, assembly lines face shortages. By December 2025, several U.S. assembly plants have already experienced temporary production slowdowns or brief stoppages due to parts shortages traced back to Japanese suppliers. These haven't made major headlines yet because automakers absorb short disruptions by adjusting schedules or pulling from safety stock, but the frequency is increasing. The second effect is production planning disruption. Automakers schedule production months in advance based on anticipated parts availability. When Japanese suppliers inform them that delivery schedules are slipping or volumes will be lower than expected, automakers have to revise production plans. This means fewer vehicles built than originally planned for the first quarter of 2026. The third effect is on specific vehicle models. Not all models are equally affected. Vehicles with higher electronic content, luxury cars, electric vehicles, advanced hybrids tend to have more Japanese components and are more vulnerable to supply disruptions. Vehicles with simpler designs and fewer electronic features may see less impact. This creates uneven effects across manufacturers and model lines. The fourth effect is cost increases. When components are in short supply, prices rise. Japanese suppliers facing higher costs in Japan due to energy prices and labor shortages are passing some costs to customers. When delivery delays force automakers to use expedited shipping or find alternative suppliers, costs increase. These increased costs will eventually be passed to consumers through higher vehicle prices. Let me give you concrete examples of what this looks like on the ground. Ford builds the F-150, America's best-selling vehicle, at plants in Michigan and Missouri. That truck contains numerous Japanese components, electronic control units, sensors, transmission parts. If deliveries of any critical component are delayed, Ford can't complete vehicles. Trucks sit partially assembled waiting for parts, tying up factory floor space and preventing the line from operating at full capacity. General Motors produces the Chevrolet Bolt EV and various hybrid models that rely heavily on Japanese battery components and electronic systems. Any disruption in those supplies directly impacts GM's ability to meet production targets for electric vehicles at a time when the company is trying to transition its fleet toward electrification. Stellantis, which includes brands like Jeep, Ram, and Chrysler, sources Japanese components for vehicles ranging from the Jeep Wrangler to the Pacifica hybrid. Supply disruptions force Stellantis to make difficult decisions about which models to prioritize and which to delay. Tesla, often seen as less dependent on traditional suppliers, actually relies significantly on Japanese components. Panasonic supplies battery cells. Japanese companies provide motors and various electronic components. Tesla's Gigafactory in Texas and other facilities depend on consistent Japanese supply deliveries. The ripple effects extend beyond the assembly plants. Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers, companies that supply parts to the companies that supply automakers, are also affected. If a Tier 1 supplier in the U.S. can't get components from Japan, they can't complete their assemblies, which means they can't deliver to automakers. The supply chain is interconnected, so disruptions propagate through multiple layers. Employment impacts are starting to appear. When assembly plants slow production due to parts shortages, they reduce shifts or temporarily lay off workers. Supplier facilities that depend on steady production volumes also cut hours or staffing. United Auto Workers Union and other labor organizations are monitoring the situation closely because production slowdowns directly affect their members' paychecks. Dealer inventories are another concern. U.S. auto dealers are already operating with lower inventory levels than historical norms due to various supply chain disruptions over the past few years. If production slows further due to Japanese parts shortages, dealer lots will have fewer vehicles available. This reduces consumer choice and can push prices higher due to scarcity. The used car market responds to new car availability. If new cars are scarce and expensive, buyers turn to used vehicles, driving up used car prices. We've seen this pattern before during the semiconductor shortage in 2021-2022. A similar dynamic could emerge if the Japanese manufacturing slowdown persists. Now, let me tell you why this is particularly problematic timing. The U.S. auto industry is in the middle of a major transition toward electric vehicles. Automakers have committed billions to electrification, are building new battery plants, and are launching new EV models. This transition requires massive volumes of advanced electronics, batteries, and new types of components, areas where Japanese suppliers are particularly important. Supply disruptions during this critical transition period could slow EV adoption. If automakers can't get the components they need to build electric vehicles in planned volumes, they'll struggle to meet regulatory requirements for emissions reductions and their own commitments to investors and consumers about electrification timelines. It also creates competitive vulnerabilities. Chinese automakers are rapidly expanding EV production and are beginning to eye international markets, including potentially the United States. If American and Japanese automakers are constrained by supply problems while Chinese manufacturers with domestic supply chains can produce at full capacity, competitive dynamics shift. China could gain market share globally at a critical moment in the industry's evolution. Let me explain what's being done to mitigate these problems, because automakers aren't simply accepting disruption, they're actively trying to work around it. First, diversification of suppliers. Automakers are looking for alternative sources for components currently supplied primarily by Japanese companies. This is easier said than done. Qualifying new suppliers takes time. You have to verify quality, test components, integrate them into production systems. You can't switch suppliers overnight for critical parts. But automakers are accelerating qualification processes where possible. Second, inventory buffering. Companies are moving away from pure just-in-time systems for the most critical components, building larger safety stocks to cushion against supply disruptions. This increases costs. Storing inventory is expensive, but provides insurance against production stoppages. Third, nearshoring and reshoring. There's increased focus on bringing production of critical components closer to final assembly plants. Some Japanese suppliers are being encouraged to expand production in the United States rather than shipping from Japan. Some production is being moved to Mexico under USMCA trade rules. This reduces dependence on trans-Pacific supply lines. Fourth, design changes. For future vehicle models, automakers are designing with supply chain resilience in mind, choosing components that can be sourced from multiple suppliers in different regions, reducing reliance on single sources, standardizing parts across more models to create economies of scale and flexibility. Fifth, direct communication and support. Automakers are working directly with Japanese suppliers to understand their constraints and sometimes providing support, financial assistance, helping secure raw materials, collaborating on production planning. The relationships between automakers and suppliers are often long-term partnerships, not just transactional, so there's incentive to help suppliers through difficult periods. Despite these efforts, the reality is that supply chain restructuring takes years, not months. The dependencies that exist today can't be eliminated quickly, so the industry is bracing for a rough first quarter of 2026, with the hope that Japanese manufacturing conditions improve later in the year. The broader economic implications are significant. The auto industry represents about 3% of U.S. GDP directly, but when you include suppliers, dealers, aftermarket, and induced economic activity, It's closer to 6% or more. Disruptions to auto production ripple through the economy. Workers have less income to spend. Suppliers see reduced revenues. Dealers sell fewer vehicles. State and local governments collect less sales tax. The multiplier effects are substantial. Consumer impacts are direct and immediate. If you're planning to buy a new car in early 2026, you may find fewer choices, longer wait times, and higher prices. Some models may be unavailable or only available with long delays. Dealers may have less flexibility to negotiate on price when inventory is tight. If you need a car urgently, you may have to compromise on model, features, or price. The used car market becomes more important as an alternative. If new cars are scarce, used vehicles become more attractive, which supports used car prices and values. This is good for people selling used cars, but difficult for buyers who face elevated prices. Let me tell you what this reveals about the vulnerabilities in our current economic system. We've built global supply chains that are incredibly efficient under normal conditions, but fragile when disrupted. The assumption has been that components will always be available from global suppliers when needed. Japan's manufacturing slowdown exposes the risk of that assumption. The auto industry's experience is a microcosm of broader supply chain challenges. We saw similar dynamics with semiconductors, with lumber, with various goods during and after the pandemic. Each disruption reveals the same lesson. Efficiency and resilience are often in tension. Just-in-time systems are efficient but not resilient. Global sourcing reduces costs but creates vulnerability to distant shocks. There's increasing discussion about whether the pendulum has swung too far toward efficiency at the expense of resilience. Should companies maintain larger inventories despite the cost? Should they source from multiple suppliers in different regions even if it's more expensive? Should they prioritize reliability over absolute lowest cost? These aren't easy questions because resilience costs money. Maintaining larger inventories, qualifying multiple suppliers, holding excess capacity, all of this reduces profit margins in normal times. Companies are pressured by shareholders to maximize returns, which often means minimizing these inefficient expenses. But when disruptions occur, the costs of not having resilience become painfully clear. Government policy is also implicated. Trade policies, industrial policies, incentives for domestic manufacturing, regulations around supply chain transparency, all of these affect how resilient supply chains are. There's growing bipartisan support in the United States for policies that encourage domestic production of critical goods, reduce dependence on single foreign sources, and build redundancy into supply chains. The CHIPS Act, Inflation Reduction Act, and other recent legislation reflect this shift toward prioritizing resilience and domestic production over pure economic efficiency. The auto industry's challenges with Japanese supply disruptions will likely strengthen arguments for similar approaches in automotive manufacturing, incentives for domestic parts production, requirements for supply chain diversification, support for critical supplier industries. Here's what I expect will happen over the next quarter. Production disruptions will continue and likely intensify in January and February 2026 as the full impact of Japan's manufacturing slowdown works through supply chains. Some assembly plants will experience temporary shutdowns or extended slowdowns. Vehicle production will be below planned levels. By March or April, we should have clearer visibility on whether Japanese manufacturing is recovering or if the slowdown is deeper and longer lasting. If Japan's economy shows signs of improvement, if Chinese demand recovers, if domestic consumption picks up, if some of the structural challenges ease, then suppliers should be able to ramp production back up and normalize deliveries by mid-2026. If Japanese manufacturing remains weak or deteriorates further, we're looking at a more prolonged period of disruption, potentially extending into the second half of 2026. In that scenario, automakers will have to make more aggressive moves, accelerating supplier diversification, potentially redesigning vehicles to use alternative components, and possibly reducing their commitment to certain vehicle programs that are too dependent on constrained Japanese supplies. For consumers, the advice is practical. If you need a vehicle in the next few months, expect limited selection and higher prices. If you can delay the purchase, conditions will likely improve later in 2026. If you're particular about a specific model or features, you may need to order and wait rather than expecting to find it on a dealer lot. For workers in the auto industry, the situation is concerning but not catastrophic. Temporary disruptions may mean reduced hours or brief layoffs, but the fundamental demand for vehicles remains. This isn't like 2008-2009 when the entire industry nearly collapsed. This is a supply-side problem that should be temporary and manageable, though undeniably painful for those affected. For policymakers, this is another data point in the ongoing debate about industrial policy, supply chain resilience, and economic security. Every disruption strengthens the argument for policies that prioritize stability and reliability over maximum efficiency and lowest cost. What troubles me is that we keep learning the same lesson over and over. Global supply chains are vulnerable. Dependence on single sources creates risk. Efficiency and resilience require balance. We learned this with semiconductors, with personal protective equipment during COVID, with various goods over the years. And yet we keep building systems that optimize for efficiency under normal conditions and fail under stress. Japan's manufacturing slowdown hitting U.S. automakers is the latest iteration of this pattern. It won't be the last. Until we fundamentally rethink how we structure supply chains, prioritizing some degree of redundancy and resilience, even at the cost of efficiency, we'll continue experiencing these disruptions. The rough quarter ahead for U.S. automakers is a symptom of a larger systemic issue. We've built an economic system that works beautifully when everything goes right and struggles when anything goes wrong. And in a complex, interconnected world, something is always going wrong somewhere. The question is whether this latest disruption will finally motivate the changes needed to build more resilient systems, or whether we'll get through this rough quarter, return to normal, and continue as before until the next disruption hits. Based on history, I'm not optimistic, but I hope I'm wrong, because the cost of continuing to learn this lesson the hard way is being paid by workers who lose shifts, consumers who pay higher prices, and an economy that's less stable than it needs to be. Japan's manufacturing slowdown will pass, supply chains will normalize, but the vulnerability remains, and until we address it systematically, we'll keep bracing for the next rough quarter and the one after that, always reacting, never quite building the resilience we know we need.